Good afternoon. Welcome to WorldOregon's special rapid reaction program on the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. We are very honored to have Professor Sarah Henderson back with us from Oregon State University. For those of you who may recall, a couple weeks ago, she was here for Great Decisions. We will post a link of that in the chat. Before we dive into today's program, we know that there are a lot of community partners who are holding events related to this. I'm going to post in the chat here shortly, not only our statement denouncing the invitation, but also some upcoming events that our partners at the Oregon Jewish Museum, the Oregon Jewish Federation, and Lewis and Clark College are all hosting this week. These are free webinars in the area. I'm posting this in the chat with the links on how to register through partners of ours that would give you an additional information besides today's program. Before we jump into it, just a reminder that this is a webinar, so only the host, the WorldOregon staff, and Dr. Henderson will be able to use audio and video. For everyone in the audience, ask you to please post your questions in the Q&A section, and we will post in the chat, like I just did, useful links and information. Again, questions in the Q&A, that really helps us to manage them with the speaker. Moderator today will again be our program director, Tim DeRoche. Again, we're thrilled to have Dr. Henderson here. Her bio is on our website. She's a distinguished professor at Oregon State University. And without further ado, the floor is hers. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Derek. Hi, everyone. I would say it's good to see everyone, but of course the reasons by which we're meeting are quite horrific. And so I wanted to spend our time trying to at least do what we can to try to get a clearer understanding of what's going on, what's at stake, what are some potential outcomes, so that we can do our best to both come to grips with what's happening, not only for Ukrainians, but for all of us all over the world. And when we met several weeks ago, we have a bigger audience today, but several weeks ago, we were talking about, at the time, what were upcoming tensions with Ukraine. And I was someone in the camp of scholars that, you know, I hoped that rising tensions would ultimately be resolved, perhaps at the last minute at the negotiating table, that the cost of military action would be too high. Military invasion seemed completely unthinkable for a leader such as Putin, who many have described as quite risk averse. However, a week ago, Monday, I was in my class teaching Russian politics. I teach it Monday, Wednesday, and a student said to turn on the news. Putin was speaking to the Russian people. And we listened to part of that speech, and I went back to my office and listened to the entire thing, as well as to the sort of staged Security Council meeting. And for the first time, I became quite worried. And if you haven't seen it, I think what concerned me is that President Putin seemed almost unhinged in terms of the narrative that he was telling. And I think we want to talk about that later, because I think it's an issue in terms of trying to figure out potential outcomes. Because in the speech, he opened up with this large sort of faux history of Ukraine, in which Ukraine didn't exist, and the portrayal of Ukraine as a dangerous nuclear threat, despite the fact that it gave up its nuclear weapons, the presence of neo-fascists that were also somehow run by the West, and the use of the word genocide to describe the Russian-supported ongoing civil war in eastern Ukraine. And so he eventually descended into recognition of the two republics, leaving the door open. But I think a week ago was for the first time that I thought this really isn't about NATO at all, that NATO is simply a symptom of a Russia-defined larger problem, that its perception and this evolving narrative under Putin as Russia is this kind of besieged fortress. And so one of the first things that people have been asking me in the past week is what does Putin want? And so there've been we've known the obvious requests about NATO and sort of trying to redraw European security. I think there's also been hypotheses about maybe redrawing the lines of the Soviet Union. But I think, what the speech really highlighted is this sort of seething resentment and hostility, this narrative that the West wants to see Russia on its knees, that the West barely respects Russia's point of view. And tellingly, RIA Novosti, which is Russia's state-owned news service, accidentally published an article on 8 a.m. on February 26th. If you Google it, you might be able to find it, because even though they've taken it down, it has popped up on the Wayback Machine, so it still exists. And the article was celebrating Russia's victory in the collapse of the Ukrainian state. And the article really says nothing about NATO, and instead the whole article is about a new era for Russia in which it restores its unity of kind of the great Russians, the white Russians, and the little Russians. And that Putin is kind of solving this problem so future generations don't need to. And so it talked about a reorganization of statehood for Ukraine, and one, which is not anti-Russian. So I think we're looking at, a goal of either a potential puppet government. It also talks about the Anglo-Saxon alliance between UK and US, and how sort of Europe is kind of this unwilling partner. So even though this isn't Putin himself writing, it's this sort of government-sponsored news service, it really echoes a worldview articulated in his 2007 Munich Security Council speech, and taken it to new levels. About a new sort of vision of a Russia in a multipolar world, as the article talks about, sort of flexing its muscle against a kind of decaying and dying West. And I think why that is significant is because it makes me very worried about potential ways to negotiate, hopefully down the line, an outcome out of this crisis. This is not something that's going to be negotiated out through some arms reduction treaties. Also striking is kind of the asymmetry in terms of the resources that Russia is willing to put into pursuing this end game, versus what the West is willing and able to do without starting a nuclear crisis. So I guess I just started off with what does Putin want? It does seem to be taken seriously as a great power, almost in maybe a sort of 19th century balance of power, with Russia's respected kind of regional power player in a weakened West. Now, what has been the response? A week or two ago, when we were talking as a group, there was a lot more worry about whether the West could even cooperate on sanctions. They were concerned that because of Western European reliance on natural gas imports, Germany's construction and investment in the Nord Stream pipeline, and the interconnectedness of all countries in the global economy, which would make cutting Russia out of the SWIFT system unfeasible, that there was real concern that there might be a repeat of Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, in which there were some sanctions slapped on individuals. But for the most part, I think there was sort of a hope that this would sort of be enough and that the problem would go away. So one outcome is not just the range of sanctions, and I won't talk about them too much, because you can all sort of Google sanctions against Russia and kind of get a list of the economic measures, some of the, not only on Russian institutions and banks. So some of those have been, a number of banks have been cut out of the SWIFT international payment system to hinder imports and exports and make it difficult for financial transactions to happen. The country's biggest bank, Sberbank, has been banned from conducting transitions from the US system. The assets of many banks have been hit with asset freezes. The Russian central bank has been blocked from deploying hard currency reserves to cut costs. There's been a ban on exports of aviation products, for example, and cutting off of credit to energy companies. But there have also been sporting restrictions, which may seem minor, but which I really think in many ways cuts at kind of Russian prestige and what we think of in political science as soft power, which is Russia's ability to influence. So most noticeably, this has been in the world of soccer, where Russia has lost the right to host the Euro Cup. FIFA has banned it from competing in sports. The Formula One Grand Prix is being canceled. Any World Cup skiing event, the Eurovision Song Contest. And part of this is significant in part because the world of sports and the Eurovision Song Contest has sort of been seen as, not a place to bring politics. So the fact that these very large and powerful organizations are willing to make this about politics, I think is really significant. And so I think these sanctions are significant not only in terms of the size and the complexity. So some of the really big ones are the suspension of the Nord Stream 2 deal by Germany, for example, but also the fundamental shift of many countries, which had dragged their feet before, who now seem energized to engage in sanctions. So for all of us who have been reading, of course, Germany has been dragging its feet on suspending Nord Stream 2, concerns that wouldn't happen. But now what many thought was unthinkable, Germany committing 2% of its defense spending now, something which nobody thought would be feasible. In reaction, Switzerland has broken its historic neutrality to join with the EU in sanctions. And more broadly, there's been larger EU unity. So in some ways, the very things that the Putin administration was counting on not happening, that it was going to be able to leverage European disunity, the exact opposite has happened. However, I think, there are a couple of caveats to that. One is certainly the effects are already starting to be felt in Russia. The Russian ruble has lost 40% of its value. The stock market has closed for the day. The central bank has tried to hike interest rates to 20%. But also in the West, the US stock exchange has dropped. Gas prices are climbing. We can expect food prices on the world market to rise because Russia and Ukraine are both grain producers. Potentially Russian cyber attacks to retaliate. Russia has also promised counter sanctions. And China will probably continue to invest in Russia, in addition to the deals that it struck with Russia before Russia invaded about importing oil and importing Russian wheat. More broadly, though, I think we also have to be realistic that sanctions can be incredibly important for signaling, extracting a cost or a punishment. But political scientists are in general find that sanctions don't necessarily deter behavior, particularly when it's an issue of a country's what's defined as a core security interest. So I think one of the difficult issues is this may not, it's not necessarily expected to change Russian behavior directly, but rather to indirectly put pressure through critical kind of interest groups within Russia, predominantly the oligarchs. So there's some concern that while sanctions are important, it's also really important to have some sanctions off-ramps. So what are the conditions under which sanctions can be lifted to potentially give incentives to Russia to negotiate if we actually want this horrific war to stop? But also real concerns, and I think many of you might feel it if you read that also that Putin has now raised kind of the nuclear threat to the next level, that these are not really going to be sufficient to really deter Russia. And so the third brief thing I wanted to address is what are the implications or how might this play out? On the one hand, what we've seen, which was also Expected, but maybe maybe not to this degree, is Ukrainian unity against this invasion by the Russian army. So to some degree, if you read the RIA Novosti article, it's sort of shocking how out of touch Russian media is with how this might play out in Ukraine. So if nothing else, and we referred to this in the talk I gave, that, you know, the annexation of Crimea in 2014 was really when Russia lost Ukraine, that in subsequent elections, you see increasing numbers of Ukrainian voters, you know, ethnic Ukrainians, ethnic Russians, voting for political parties that had a less pro-Russia economic tie stance. So one way that this will play out, and why it's so puzzling in terms of, in some ways, what Putin wants, is just simply increased Ukrainian resistance, that this can't possibly end well for the Russian army. Ukrainian resistance is both stronger and more well organized than people expected. Allies have increased their arms supply. The Russian military performance has been worse. I think in a stroke of genius, the Ukrainian military has been allowing Russian soldiers that are captured to call their mothers back home. Because there's been so little information released by the Russian state about the status of the campaign. But I am extremely sober when thinking about potential outcomes. I don't see this ending anytime soon. Given Putin's rhetoric, I don't see that he's interested in backing down at all. Belarus has now committed troops. On top of that, Russia still has about 2/3 of its troops. It still has 1/3 in reserve that it can send in. I think upping the nuclear threat, I am worried, because given his past actions, I don't think that this is sort of idle rhetoric. But given the Ukrainian solidarity that has become even stronger, I don't see potential solutions which were floated around several weeks ago, like Ukrainian declarations of neutrality, to be politically feasible or realistic. So I think, where will this all end? I am simply extremely sad, and I just don't see it resolving itself soon. And I hope to see increasing information available about humanitarian assistance and how we can help Ukrainians achieve really feasible alternative options until this ends. And in terms of implications for Putin at home, I am actually quite worried about the mental state of President Putin. Someone asked me on TV if I think he's insane. I'm not a pop psychologist. I don't know anything, but I certainly believe that a little bit of what we're seeing are the implications of when someone stays in power for 22 years, and in the process of that period develops a set of policies and tools at home to slowly cut off alternative points of view as portrayed through the media, by allowing NGO activism or even citizens to organize on the streets. And I think part of this is a result of the strangulation of political pluralism internally. Increasingly, he's lost touch with alternative points of view, at least I think in earlier stages in his administration. There were sort of battles between kind of the more technocratic sides of his administration and the more nationalist. Clearly, the kind of security nationalist services have won. I would expect to see an increase in rhetoric of internal enemies abroad and internal enemies at home, in order to kind of cover up how poorly this war seems to be going for Russia. Protests already have led to 2,500 arrests. And while the protests have not been large, The impediments to protesting in Russia in 2022 were so significant in terms of being caught at an unsanctioned protest can lead to significant fines, jail time, the loss of a career, if nothing else, being beaten up by the police. I think that this is an enormous act of bravery of Russian citizens. But I think what's also really concerning is that there are few mechanisms for removing Putin from power because of the lack of checks on the presidency that have slowly sort of fallen to the side since he stepped into the presidency in 2000. Presidential elections are in 2024. That is the first opportunity citizens will have to legitimately weigh in. We don't yet know if he's going to run for office. But probably the biggest danger for Putin potentially comes from within. And so the big decision that must be going on among the elites within the next year or two is whether it makes sense to stick with Putin and kind of sit it out, or to use 2024 to try to affect some kind of internal change. But this is something over which the West is simply not going to have necessarily a lot of leverage over. I think in closing, I think probably what you're also going to see in the media is a lot of, second guessing. In hindsight, what could have been done differently? Should we have not engaged in the reset in foreign policy from 2008 to 2012 when Medvedev and Obama were in the presidency? Should we have offered Ukraine NATO membership? Should we have never mentioned NATO membership for Ukraine? Should we have pushed Ukraine to agree to neutrality? Or should we have cracked down harder on Russia in 2008 after Russia's military incursion in Georgia, or after it seized Crimea in 2014? I'm no good at those kinds of debates. I'm actually the kind of teacher that has always tried to teach about these dueling narratives between the West and Russia, and to try to explain how Russia does define national security differently, not just from Putin, but also Medvedev and Yeltsin. But at some point, I'm no longer able to kind of engage in the kind of the West made Putin do it argument. I think when we understand the invasion of Ukraine, could there have been more off-ramps? Maybe. But I think Putin and his inner circle deliberately stoked themselves up into this position. And so I think when we're looking to understand the Ukraine crisis, I think we truly have to wrestle with the problems of trying to impact a political system in which decisions are made by an extremely small group of people. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. It's only 2:25. So I'm actually talking on my phone because my computer audio isn't working. So Tim, I'm just going to kind of rely on you. I'm not going to be able to see anything popping up in the chat. So I'm just going to tell me fine.
Sarah, that is perfectly fine. And welcome to our audience. This is Tim DeRoche, the Director of Programs for WorldOregon. Let us jump straight into questions. Derek is putting up a little map here. Just for some context, this is a map borrowed from the New York Times that was about 18 hours old. So you get a sense of sort of where things are at. I mean, as we were talking about before the program, this is such a fast moving and fastly evolving situation. It will probably look different in a couple days. But so let's jump in and talk about the region a little bit, Sarah. So if Ukraine falls, God forbid, would Putin's next stop be Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia?
Right. I mean, I'm the type of person who'd be like, no, I don't think that's so. I mean, I think I think from his recent speeches and the way that he has framed Ukraine, it sounds like a sort of reconstruction of this sort of original sense of Russia as being Belarusia, Little Russia, and Greater Russia. But I have to say, it's like all of my predictions are kind of off the table at this point because I was so taken aback by his rhetoric last week. So I would like to think no. I do think that there is something significant about Ukraine and Russia's view of the historical narrative it plays, but also given its threat perception that, you know, the West is a threat, maybe it will, you know, it certainly sees itself as needing to somehow defend other areas of the world from Western aggression. So I don't even know anymore.
Well, so this question of really amping up the nuclear threat, I mean, it's certainly ominous. I mean, for any of us who grew up under Cold War, I mean, this was, I mean, we lived with this.
Right.
But you know, we've read that countries on the fence about joining NATO, like Sweden and Finland, are under threat of, quote, military consequences from Putin. How does the international community approach this and deal with this?
Right. Well, I think right now, frankly, I think we're sort of in survival mode where it's about, I mean, I think the main thing is seeing if unity can be maintained on sanctions. I think that's literally kind of the day-to-day problem solving that's going on. I will be curious to see if in a week or two, there'll be kind of a shift if there's some kind of development or indication. So say, for example, if it looks like we're going to be in kind of a long haul for Ukraine, or things go very badly for Ukraine, that might tip the scales in terms of talking about Sweden. If it sort of looks like the goal kind of maintains, you know, continues to be sort of trying to support Ukraine, then that might be pushed from the agenda. You know, I think right now there's so much kind of daily diplomacy going about problem solving the reaction to Russia on a daily basis. I don't know what the bandwidth is for kind of these next bigger issues.
Well, so you talked about the lack of checks and balances. One of our questions is, if Putin is unstable, and are there any checks and balances in the government to stop him from using nuclear weapons? And can he just simply do this without any other approval?
Well, so yeah, that's a great question. That was something I started trying to, you know, I'm sure we've all gone down these rabbit holes of the internet, you know, like, so all I know from what I started to read about is there are kind of 4 levels of kind of nuclear threat. So there's the level 1 is sort of what's on at all times. And so by elevating to level 2, it kind of removes the obligatory sort of nuclear codes that you need to put in order to avoid maybe a false launch. But there are still kind of 2 more levels. So at some point, this is a very kind of deliberate kind of amping up of the pressures. Now, President Biden very also deliberately did not retaliate and do the same in the United States. So I think the US right now is trying to kind of back off and not engage in this game of one-upmanship at this point, because there are 2 additional layers of kind of nuclear safeguards to go through.
So, you know, in the wake of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and we look at the criticism from the right for Biden, we're also still looking at the U.S. mending relations with transatlantic allies from
Right.
the administration. So, is that going to affect our ability to have any legitimate leadership on this in a global setting?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I think it's, you know, I think the sort of US reputation, I mean, it goes all the way back to the war in Iraq, 2003. I think that was an enormous blow to prestige. I think the Trump administration's approach to foreign policy did not help. So I'm actually surprised that there's as much unity as there has been, given the decline of soft power among the US and of Europe. But I think what's really hard, the articles that I've read, is this sort of the post-Cold War era is over. It's not clear. The West might be united right now, but it's just not clear that it has kind of the soft power to push a kind of negotiated outcome that we might feel good about for Ukraine, right? So it could be that Ukraine neutrality is kind of the cost or something. I don't know. But I do think we have to. One of the good things, it has gotten the West focusing on democracy matters again, but we're just operating from a weaker position, and that's not going to change. It's kind of unclear what's going to how China. I'm sure someone's asked a question about where's China in all of this. It's kind of watching, I'm sure, in a very interesting way to see how this might change its interests about Taiwan and how it wants to express its aspirations and goals for reabsorbing Taiwan. So they're also just things out of our control. I mean, the thing that I keep coming back to is this sort of, there's no way to kind of control President Putin. We can issue sanctions, but we're sort of, we for so long we've relied on these norms to kind of govern relations, and he's just simply flipped over that whole kind of playbook, and I think it's really hard to figure out how to respond to that.
Well, and so that brings up the question of sanctions. I mean, sanctions are, for decades have been a very debated tactic.
Yes.
Sanctions tend to hurt people and civilian populations and not necessarily the people in power. So what can the international community do to support the Russian people who are not supporting the incursion and in fact have attempted to be vocal about their opposition, or are our hands simply tied?
Well, so I think there are, there are things on the margin. So some things I've read, I've just sort of said things like, please don't cancel flights out of Russia. Kind of the last thing that you want to do is, sort of sanction or, make it impossible for Russians themselves to leave if they need to. Another suggestion has been, you have to be really careful about, setting limits and not putting a freeze on assets that are below a certain level, because again, you're kind of freezing the assets of, the very Russians that really have no say on Putin's policies. But I think more broadly, there is also this sense of what other options are there? We're sort of just in this state, right, where we have to signal that invasion is unacceptable. Sanctions are one of the few tools that states have as a coercive economic measure. So it's a blunt tool. In terms of other ways to offer aid, so one issue is sort of trying to have loopholes in the sanctions that don't sort of prevent ordinary Russians from being able to leave or spend their much smaller pots of money. I think other things that we have relied on in the past, like academic exchanges, et cetera, are extraordinarily difficult now, given that Vladimir Putin asked USAID to leave in 2012. He has kicked out the Peace Corps. So I think all of these smaller opportunities that citizens just had, right, for exchange have really been limited, not by the US, but by the Russian government.
Well, in thinking about, the tactics and strategies to limit a government, I mean, sanctions have always been one of them, but we're in a different place than we ever were in terms of being wired or wireless for war. I mean, we have cyber activity, we've got cryptocurrency. There's some speculation that the ruling class and oligarchs may simply move economic activity into their cryptocurrency sphere. What are your thoughts on that? And what are you hearing from your colleagues in this realm?
Well, I don't know anything about cryptocurrency, but I was reading, part of, another reason why people are focusing on sanctions is because kind of cyber warfare, at least in this context, is even if it may be a blunt tool, we know more about sanctions, right? We have less to go on in terms of what has happened when you get into a kind of tit for tat cyber warfare strategy. So from what I had read, that was kind of one of the thoughts, is kind of holding off on cyber warfare, because even though it's been used one way, we have less of a sense of what happens if two countries were to go kind of at each other in the same way as physical warfare. And so again, we're kind of back to a 20th century tool that we're more familiar with, for better or for worse.
Well, and the cyber attacks in some ways it's asymmetrical warfare in a great power setting, and so it seems like it is. There's so little we know about it, and we certainly have removed a lot of protections in terms of safeguarding against it. And we've seen more about cyber attacks very, very recently in terms of hackers taking things down, and the Russian government using cyber attacks against Ukraine.
Right.
It gives one pause.
Right. Well, and I think just also largely more, not even cyber attacks on its own citizenry, but just using its power through Roskomnadzor, the kind of, internet regulating agency or media. So, Facebook has been slowed down in Russia. Google has been slowed down in Russia. It's difficult for citizens to be able to kind of download pictures and get information. The state has been able to use its authority to remove information from the internet about the war. And so that's a little bit different than what you were talking about, but also the government has a lot more tools, again, in terms of its own people kind of blocking their ability to get a counter narrative.
Well, so you mentioned that, we might probably have a question about China in the mix. We actually do not have a question about China.
Oh, okay.
But I think that the China question, I'm very curious about, not just China, but India in this equation, because India and China are both dealing with disputed territories in that same way, and yet both are being fairly hands-off and quiet in the face of what we've been seeing over the last week. And
right.
where does that go?
Well, so I think, I know less about the India-Russia relationship, but I certainly know that, kind of the perception about the partnership between Russia and China is kind of one of convenience, and sort of the perception is that Russia needs China more than China needs Russia. So that, China is not going to go out on a limb for Russia on this one, that it might continue economic relationships, but it's certainly not going to maybe put itself out there for Russia. Because I think to some extent, and I think one of the things now that the US is dealing with is whether to try to drive a wedge in between Russia and China, because China tends to navigate a little bit differently on the international stage than Russia does. So, I'm not sure that China right now wants to kind of get into the orbit of right now, Russia sort of being treated as a pariah state. I don't know how long that'll last.
So we've got a question which makes me think of the wonderful series that was done a few years ago called Occupied. And I'm not sure if anyone in the audience remembers this, but it's about Russia invading Norway because Norway has given up fossil fuels. And so it's speculative fiction. So the question is, with his contempt for the West and the desire to take back former Russian lands, have you considered that Putin might want Alaska?
Oh gosh. No, but I mean, I have this lack of imagination because I just thought it was insanity that he would want to invade Ukraine. But I think more broadly, I mean, I think what, when we look at Russia's relationship with other former parts of the Soviet Union, like most recently with Kazakhstan, like Russia can't financially afford to kind of absorb these territories. I think what it wants is kind of friendly client states on its borders. It certainly can't afford to kind of absorb Belarus into its economy. It can't really realistically afford to absorb Ukraine. And I think until Ukraine, I think what it was trying to do was sort of show that it could be a reliable partner in terms of kind of helping regimes stay in power. That's really what it was sort of establishing a niche for itself as, by supporting the Assad regime in Syria. With Kazakhstan, it just went in quickly after invoking the CSTO, kind of put down the protests, and then was kind of out again with its military. And maybe it was just sort of so kind of diluted, it thought that would happen again with Ukraine. But I think in some ways, it wants to be kind of a trusted kind of order enforcer, in contrast to kind of its perception of the West as this sort of disordered, chaotic, full of protesters challenging the state universe.
Well, so the thing we're not hearing a lot about is there are other liberal democracies that have been flirting with authoritarianism. And I think of Hungary, I think of Turkey. Where are they in the conversation right now?
Well, I think Hungary is kind of, sort of on board with the EU, that the Orban regime, and somebody correct me, because I just sort of saw this briefly before I went to go teach class, and then I taught, and then I came back and I'm talking to y'all. But I think Orban is kind of, more back into the EU fold. And I feel like Turkey has also not really kind of come out for Putin, that it's still kind of hinting that it may block Russian ships into the Black Sea potentially. It's concerned, but it's certainly not kind of rushing out there hoping that Russia will set an example for it to, act in a similar fashion towards Kurdistan or anything. So if anyone, I can't see the chat, but if anyone has a different perception, please offer up information you've read. Because, I think we're all just reading furiously, trying to keep up with it all.
Well, and that brings up a good question, which is sources. Being able to navigate the flurry and the thicket of sources of information on this. What are some, maybe a handful of sources that you go to or you think would be good for people in the audience to turn to? We put up a few Twitter handles of people that came through our friend Peter Singer, but if there's some that you could kind of just pinpoint, that would be really, really wonderful.
I mean, I'm pretty middle of the road media reader. So, my personal subscription is for the New York Times. I think in terms of work, where you can see sort of lots of different points of view, I subscribe to Foreign Policy and Foreign Affairs. And so there you can kind of see lots of, different short kind of perspectives. And so, on foreign policy, if you go there, you might read an article by a realist oh my gosh, I'm having a total senior moment, about how, kind of this is all the West's fault and, what Russia needs to do. The Ukraine never should have been offered, NATO membership, and you can read all of those arguments, and then you can just click on a different link and, read a different article about how, no, we really need to understand this as a prism.
And Sarah, to echo that, I mean, I think we're talking about people like Stephen Walt and Thomas Ricks and some of those,
yes.
Some of those kind of folks who are going to be, sometimes on different ends of the spectrum, but
right.
Give you some really good critical insight.
Yeah, so foreign policy and foreign affairs will kind of give you the whole range. If you want to kind of get a Russia perspective that's not a Kremlin narrative. Now, if I wanted to get the Kremlin narrative, sometimes I would go to RT to see how it's being spun, but I just don't have the stomach for that right now. But I think it's always valuable to try to see like how is the information being delivered. Of course, RT is targeted towards us, not towards Russians. It's a quick view. But if you want to also just see how independent Russian media is reporting on it, I follow Meduza News, which is run out of one of the Baltic countries, and so it has a Russian language site, but also English, Meduza. I also go to the Moscow Carnegie Center, part of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And that's, a Carnegie Endowment funded Russian think tank that hires, Russian analysts and political scientists and, foreign policy thinkers to write about Russia, not from a pro-Kremlin point of view, but definitely from sort of a thinking from more of a Russian perspective about Russian kind of, what are Russian national security interests? And the writing is sometimes just a little bit different than, the West. In terms of Twitter, I'll follow Michael McFaul, who's the former ambassador to Russia, 2012, 2014, who's kind of pro-sanctions, we have to build unity, but I'll also follow someone named Mark Galeotti, Galeotti, who's an academic in London, has a podcast called In Moscow's Shadow, and he has a little bit of a different spin on Putin as he's much less of kind of an evil genius and probably a little bit kind of making decisions ad hoc. So he has interesting insights. And then if you want sort of more of the, Putin has very clear military ambitions to restore the, the borders of the Soviet Union or something, then I would listen to the viewpoints of a podcast called The Power Vertical. And I'm also just having this moment of, I can't remember the host. He also has guests, but those tend to be more kind of like hard power realist analysts. And so I try to kind of listen to all of those so I can just, just get the full range, because I don't know what the answer is. The best thing I can do is like go out there and read lots of information and try to synthesize it.
Well, and that is the fun part. I always joke that that's what we do at World Oregon. We get paid to read the news and try and make sense of it for people.
Yeah.
Another Soviet state or former Soviet state that we haven't talked about is Belarus. So how might this play out for Belarus as we see Lukashenko seeming to support and send troops in? Is this going to lead to further isolation and sanctions for Belarus as well, which is not necessarily doing well?
Yes. No, I would say yes. I think the sanctions are rolling out now on Belarus. So no, it's not going to go well. And I think also the implication, all of you remember, there were large kind of anti-Lukashenko protests at the last round of presidential elections. What was that, 2 years ago now? And I think this will just sort of strengthen the relationship between obviously Russia and Belarus and kind of Russia's willingness to help Belarus put down domestic protests as well down the road. So yes, sanctions will come next for Belarus. And I think it also does not bode well for democratic activists.
So I guess I'm curious, we've certainly been talking about this a little bit. What do we make of, and how do we counter the fact that the invasion of Russia has now taken on a partisan frame within our own borders?
Right. I don't know. I mean, I think, I think the Republican Party is still split. I don't know if anyone saw Mitt Romney's interview where, he had kind of a very clear response to the idea that Putin is somehow a genius. I don't have an academic response. It just sort of makes me want to cry. This person has invaded a country, launched the deaths of hundreds, if not thousands, of his own people, of people in Ukraine. How is it genius to be a bully and kind of take the game board, and by tossing it up in the air and stomping all over it, like, you win? I'm hoping these are precisely the types of things that Putin is counting on happening, though. So I just hope all of those politicians in the United States that want to keep this little fight going, that it's kind of playing into Putin's hands. Interestingly, far-right leaders in Europe have been a lot more muted in sort of issuing approval of what's happening. So this is a unique American phenomenon.
So we've got a question here about whether you could talk about Putin promoting the concept of Moscow being the third Rome. I mean, are we seeing this happen? How much of this impulse right now is about him trying to solidify his legacy?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, and I don't know if someone had sent out the link for that RAI Novosti, article. There's English language translations by now. It certainly seemed as if it was being framed as like sort of Putin's doing this to secure a future for, Russia, that, other rulers down the road aren't willing to do. So yeah, maybe he thought this was, a lot of people talk about the timing of this as kind of being before the 2024 potential either handoff or continuation of power of Putin. And so that this is very deliberately done at this time as either kind of a not too close to the elections, but timed so that it's either wrapping up his career or kind of, segueing into another 12 years. It certainly sounds, I don't know about y'all, but I've been reading every day. I start the day just kind of reading a book from a Russian history, one of my Russian history books. I'll read a chapter and I just feel like I'm back in the 19th century with this, kind of autocracy, orthodoxy, conservatism that's kind of coming out of the Putin regime. And this whole kind of counting on power politics as being able to play two countries off of one or three off of two feels very, very 19th century to me.
Well, so, for any of us who are involved with social media, we've certainly seen, the people posting the Ukraine flag on their Facebook pictures, and there's a lot of, there's a lot of rumble on social media. But to be real, what is it that we can do right now to support Ukraine and the Ukrainian people in this time of crisis?
Well, I think it's, I think Western governments are, sort of doing the, providing arms to increase the Ukrainian capacity to fight back. And so I think what we're really talking about is trying to get hooked up in some capacity with providers of humanitarian assistance. I think this is always the important issue where there's money, but it seems like never enough, in terms of trying to absorb the short and long-term costs of a refugee crisis that, is going to be hitting Poland, Hungary, Moldova. What are we thinking of? Slovenia? I'm trying to think of other countries. So, I would say, just as a human being that feels so, understands the need of the Ukrainian army to fight back, but that feels so horrifying. I know for me, it would feel so enriching to try to figure out how can I either send money or assistance, or for me down the road, participate in a seminar, set up a workshop, a training for Ukrainians that are going to need help, not just this year, but I think in the coming years to kind of keep Western influence and contacts alive, because I don't think Russia is going to give up this fight quickly.
Great. Well, Sarah, I want to bring Derek back on to take us out into the day. I really want to thank you for spending your time with us. I mean, this is twice in a month. It's wonderful to have your rich sense of perspective and to help us really try and walk through what is a very, very complex issue with not a lot of clear answers. So thanks again. And Derek, it is all yours.
Thanks so much, Tim. Thanks, Sarah. Really fantastic discussion on a difficult topic. I want to reiterate that WorldOregon has put out a public statement denouncing the Russian invasion. I'm posting again in the chat what I posted at the beginning, which is our upcoming events of community partners that will be diving into more details of what Sarah has gone over today. And I would also just note that this will probably be a subject that will come up when we have our Great Decisions event this Friday on the Quad Alliance. It was notable that India was one of the ones abstaining at the UN Security Council vote. India, a member of the Quad Alliance with US, Japan, and Australia. So it will be touched on, I'm sure, in Great Decisions. Professor Henderson, thank you so much for your expertise and your flexibility. Audience, thank you for the outstanding questions. As Tim said, let's just keep people of Ukraine in our thoughts and hope for the best. And thank you so much for joining us today for today's webinar.
All right, thank you.